This is the voice of Mr. Derek. 313 285 6627. Today, we have a great, amazing opportunity to interview the head coach of the Mayweather boxing gym. It is a marvelous gym, and I'm going to let him develop the story momentarily. But this event is sponsored by the house that God built. And we want to let you know a little bit about that house. The house that God built was a house that was desecrated. It was destroyed by vandals in the city of Detroit. And we are going to repair and rehabilitate that house. And we will dedicate the house to the community. That's really the basis of what we will do. And the house will sponsor shows and sponsor events just like this to help empower and develop the community. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Calvin. How are you, sir?
All is well, sir. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All righty. So, Calvin, would you first of all tell us your full name and tell us a little bit about what you do here?
All right. So my name is Kevin Orlando Clay II. I was named right after my father. This location here, this Mayweather Boxing and Fitness out in Birmingham. I'm the head instructor here. We pretty much do everything from personal training, boxing classes. We do self-defense classes here for some of our private members. We offer semi-private programs. We offer private sessions, and we have group fitness classes as well.
Wow. While explaining that background to me, we had a chance to go over a little bit of your personal background.
Yes, sir.
And I don't want to get too personal, so stop me if we ever get too personal. But your story is a story of from tragedy to triumph. And I'm amazed at it. So let's start. Okay. You was born. Tell me what happened at birth.
So upon just a few moments into me being born, I actually had to have a blood transfusion. My mother had some very difficult complications giving me birth. Shortly after, like I said, I had to get a blood transfusion. They kept my mother in the hospital for a couple weeks, prior to me getting discharged. I was raised, my grandmother, my dad was taking care of me for the most part up until my mother was able to get released from the hospital. So that established a really close bond and relationship even to this day with my grandmother now. She's my right hand, everything. She's always been there for me. I love her very much because of that. But that was, like I said, even from the start of birth.
Wow.
Came into the world with some difficulties and traumas.
Wow. At 6 years old, something else happened. Tell me about it.
So I was 5 years old. As far as I remember, my mother told me, I'll never forget it. I didn't look well. I can't really explain exactly what was going on at the time. She just said I didn't look well. She rushed me to the emergency, and when she got me to the emergency, that's how I found out, I was a type 1 diabetic. They diagnosed me right then and there. I had to spend my 6th birthday in the hospital. They had me under a lot of different medications at the time. I was prone to hyperglycemia. So hyperglycemia, I'm prone to high blood sugar. So my blood sugar was like unreadable when I got initially diagnosed at that young of an age. So I spent my 6th birthday along with a couple extra weeks in the hospital trying to get my life together. At that point, it was a struggle, but I had a lot of support and I had a lot of love and a lot of family there supporting me during that time.
That's good. Bullying. Talk to me about your experience with bullying.
I got bullied a lot, believe it or not. Being so young with diabetes, I was a lot smaller than a lot of my peers, taking insulin, I'm an insulin dependent diabetic. So, from all of the frequent injections, not, understanding, proper nutrition and stuff at the time, I was a lot smaller than a lot of the people that I grew up with. Almost all of my friends, family, cousins, all of my peers, everybody was bigger than me. So, at the time, my dad was very active in my life, but he had some things going on personally that he had to really tend to. And because I'm the eldest of my siblings, I didn't have anybody that I could really go to, you know, in those moments. You mean, I was staying with my grandmother. We were living, what was that, 7 Mile in Greenfield, right off Coyle and Curtis. I remember several times used to be going across the street, Peterson Park. I used to be getting jumped. I got bullied there. You know, I got robbed a couple times. I remember one time I'm coming home, you know, I didn't have nothing but my underwear and socks on, you know, so it happened a lot, you know. Then my parents decided to move me from my grandmother's house. We moved, I believe we was in Oak Park for a little while. I transitioned and was going to Oak Park public schools. Even there, you know, the kids weren't no different. You know, I was in a different area, but it was the same circumstances. You know, I was getting bullied a lot in school. I used to get made fun of a lot because of my diabetes. You know, I remember one time I was sitting in the lunchroom, you know, I was having a blood sugar episode. My sugar had dropped and I needed some candy, and a student came over and opened a little sugar pack and poured it all over my head, you know. So remembering stuff like that, man, I grew up with a lot of rage. I grew up with a lot of anger, you know, because I just didn't understand, you know, what it was that I did to deserve a life like that. You know, I just wanted to be the happy, loving kid. I saw my cousins, you know, with their brothers and sisters. They run around, they would be playing around, you know. Meanwhile, I'm the one looking over my shoulder wondering if someone's going to point a gun to me or if I'm about to get jumped by 4 or 5 people, you know. So my perspective on a lot of things kind of started shifting from that standpoint. So.
It's quite, I guess, hurtful to go back and to think of the bullying and the rage and the trauma that you had. You were actually always in a fight or flight situation.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
So, you know, between, you know, having to, I don't want to consider myself at the time a pacifist, but it was just I was afraid to fight. You know, I didn't ever want to be, you know, like this angry, you know, rage kid. You know, I just wanted to have fun. I wanted to have friends and play around, play video games and stuff like that. So for me, you know, it was never really an option of me wanting to fight. You know, it was more so like fight or die type of thing. You know, it was some of those situations when I was getting jumped, you know, if I didn't fight back, I probably would have lost my life a long time ago. And, you know, I'll never forget one particular incident. I got jumped. I got beat up pretty bad, and my dad was sitting like right on the porch. And, you know, he told me the next time you get into a fight and you don't fight back, you know, you're going to fight me. And, you know, being a kid at the time, you know, like, am I really gonna fight my dad? Like, does he mean that? But I just remember it putting so much fear in me because, you know, at the time, you know, my dad had just got released. You know, he had to serve a little bit of time. Like I said, he got his entire life together, you know, so that's a blessing and a testimony within itself. But at the time, you know, I wanted to be like my dad. My dad was one of those guys, you know, you didn't mess with him on the street. You know, people kind of feared my dad. You know, he had this persona about him, and, you know, it was just this way that he carried himself where people just didn't want to mess with him. And it was just like, man, why? What do I need to do to be like that? You know, because I'm always getting bullied. I'm like, I don't see nobody, you know, mess with my dad, so why mess with me? So because of that, you know, I started following in a lot of the ways. You know, my dad told me, like I said, if you don't fight back this time, I'm gonna beat you. And he meant that, like a literal beating. And I remember I got jumped at that same park. You know, he stood there and he watched, and I tried to fight back, didn't do much. Then he ran over there to try to come over there and help me. The kids fled. And I remember that was the first time that I felt like I had really like disappointed my dad. You know, I got a whooping because of it, you know, but it wasn't abuse or anything. You know, he was really just trying to toughen me up and tell me like I don't have nothing to be fearful of or to be scared of. But I didn't interpret it that way as a kid. So it kind of added on to
but
rage.
Let me interject. There was a delay or a portion where your father wasn't really an active part in your life. Is that correct?
He's always been active. He just he couldn't physically be there sometimes because like when he was doing his time, they would let him come out sometime, but he had to return. Like they would let him like still go to work. He would still like provide. He's always provided and made sure I had what I needed. But it was like a lot of those intimate moments where I like needed like physically needed him there. I needed his presence to be there to be able to like pick up the phone and call him sometimes, you know, but
he wasn't there.
Yeah, he couldn't be there at the time.
But we're going to, in a short time or after these messages, we're going to return and we'll see how you had an episode, I think was age 13 or
First one, yeah, 13.
Yeah, you almost died then. And that we're going to look at what happened with your life right after that.
Sounds good.
This is, again, the house that God built. God builds the house and he takes care of his people. He does. He does. But we have here the head coach of Mayweather Boxing Gym. And he was just going over his life story. Your father, like I said, was spotty or different parts. He was not as active in your life as you might need. And his relationship with your mother was not that good. Okay. But at what age did you say you had a situation where you had almost died, and how did that affect your relationship with your father?
So we actually had quite a few of those, unfortunately, but hey, here we are to tell it. The first major one that happened, actually, how old was I? I want to say I was 14. I was 14 going on 15. First encounter, I was with two of my buddies. We were riding our bikes around. So at the time, I had like restrictions on how far I can go with my friends and stuff like that. I couldn't just parlay and riding around the entire city. So we were staying in Southwood at the time. We had rode our bikes down to nearly like Northland Mall at the time. It was on 9 Mile in Greenfield. And when we got there, I started noticing, I felt like my blood sugar was starting to drop a little bit. And I also had noticed a familiar face. There was a guy he was a lot older than me at the time. Like I said, I was around 14. He had to have been around 22 or 23. He had about 4 or 5 friends, and just kind of fast forwarding, it was like my childhood all over again. They beat me up. They was trying to take my bike. They kept asking me for my bike and my wallet, my money, whatever it was that I had. And because I had like 2 friends with me, I kind of tried to, fight it off. Didn't go well. They beat me like really, really bad. I had been doing a little bit of training and stuff at the time, but I wasn't training like the way that I'm training now. I was kind of like dipping and dabbing with it a little bit here and there, but beat me up really bad on top of the fact that my blood sugar was dropping. Like I said, fast forwarding, I was in the hospital for a little while, and my EKG from my heart frequency, was off. Even still to this day, I have to carry this little card, like, God forbid, if I was to like get hospitalized or something again, every single time that like they'll run an EKG on my heart frequency, it would almost appear like I was having a heart attack, but I really wasn't. I just have an irregular heartbeat. So this particular time, though, like my heart was actually irregularly beating. So, oh man, I just remember like my head spinning really bad. I was getting these really, really bad chest pains and stuff. They had to give me this little breathing tube to breathe out of for about 3.5 months to re-expand my lungs. One of my lungs started collapsing. My airways was just slowly just shortening up and shortening up and shortening up more and more. And was just making it harder and harder and harder for me to breathe. So for about 3 months, I had to breathe through this tube to re-expand my lung capacity. And my doctors had told me at that time, I had just turned 15 at that time, if I continue, training and pushing myself, with my heart, because I've always been an athlete, I was running track, I played football, I was boxing, I was doing martial arts. This is partially why I was like on and off with my training, because I was doing so many sports at the same time, trying to find, my confidence. But told me if I kept training like that, I probably wouldn't live to see 18. And I was just confused as to why. And it was telling me, you're overworking your heart. If you continue doing this, you might have to have a heart catheterization. I didn't know what that was at the time. And I was just like, all right, sure. Couple years later, fast forwarding right after my 18th birthday, that's exactly what happened. I was having some complications with my diabetes. Things wasn't looking well. I had to get admitted into the hospital. It was initially because my blood sugar was running too high, but when it was running my tests and everything, my EKG was off again. And at that point, I had to get a heart catheterization. I still had this mark on my wrist. I had to insert a tube right through my forearm, right through my wrist. That went all the way up my arm through the arteries. Like I said, to help me re-expand, to keep my blood flowing and for me to breathe. I had those. That was my first like actual minor procedure.
Just trying to cut to the chase.
Mm-hmm.
At what point did your father get more active in your life?
He got more active in my life shortly right after my diagnosis. When I initially got diagnosed at 6 years old, like I said, from like the time that I was born up until like 4 or 5 is when he was transitioning with a lot of the stuff that he had going on in his personal life. But it wasn't until like my initial diagnosis, you know, when you realize like, yo, like I almost lost my son here, you know, that's when he started getting a little bit more active in my life. He started, like I said, being there a lot more. That's when he really got his life together. It was like my diagnosis is what I really truly believe.
So how did that affect this relationship with your mother?
So at the time, like I said, my parents were separated. You know, they were married before, then they got separated. During that separation period, while my dad was trying to get his life back together, like I said, I have a brother now. He, you know, had other relations, and now, you know, my brother is born. So at the time, you know, my mom and my dad, they were still communicating and talk, you know, but I was kind of just living in a split household. You know, I would come see my dad from a couple of days out of the week. I'd go back and see my mom for a couple of days out of the week. But like I said, it wasn't until, you know, my diabetes really started kind of taking a toll where he was realized that, okay, maybe I need to stay permanently in my son's life. So at that point, you know, he was able to work some things out with him and my mother. And, you know, my little brother now, you know, he would come and stay with us from time to time. So it went from me being in a split household to both my parents being back together. Now my little brother is in a split household. So and that's pretty much how it was all the way up until, you know, I became an adult and I moved out.
But the thing is that your tragedy with your diabetes brought your relationship with your father and mother. Go ahead and tell us, the audience, about that.
Yeah, it brought my parents back together for sure. You know, my mom always was trying to raise me to be righteous. She raised me. She brought me up in church and everything. And, you know, like I said, because I wanted to be like dad so much, my dad wasn't as active, you know, in church and stuff at the time. So me wanting to be more like dad, you know, and him realizing that everything that he did, I wanted to do. So it was one of those, either I need to make this change for my son, or he's just going to continue walking in these same footsteps. So that's why I continue to say that I believe my diagnosis really helped, because when he realized how much more I needed him, you know, and realized the severity of my illness, and, you know, my mom couldn't do it on her own. I mean, I'm sure she could have, but it was just made it a lot harder. So at that point, you know, he really started like, you know, the whole like street thug type of mentality that he kind of had when I was younger started slowly fading out. He started getting more active in church. You know, he started like, at a point, I do remember, you know, we started going to church together as a family, you know, and those are some of the most precious moments that I still remember to this day, because I wanted to be like my dad so bad. Like I said, because of my illness, I'm like, ain't nobody mess with this guy. So I always saw this hard, solid version of my dad. I never really saw the soft, compassionate version of him. So seeing him, you know, serving with my mom, seeing him ushering at church, seeing how active, you know, it just made the flow of my life a lot better. It made it a lot easier for me to cope with my illness. Because at the time,
the $6 million question, $6 million question. Are they still together now?
Yes, sir.
Oh, talk about it.
Yes, my parents now have been back together, I believe. If they see this, forgive me. I believe they've been back together for 17 consecutive years now.
17 years.
Yep.
Praise God. Praise God.
Yep, they were married. They were separated for, I believe, 3 or 4 years, and they've been back together ever since. 17 years later.
Let's give God some glory. Hey,
amen.
Hey, all right.
Yep.
Let's fast forward to you and to what's happening now. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah. So, you know, and like I said, since I had started, I've always been, you know, an athlete my life. Like I said, me being involved in different.
I want to know about some of them championships. I want to know about the judo. Come on.
Oh yeah, we're gonna get to it. Like I said, being an athlete my whole life, like I said, this is what I use, you know, that I believe the gift that God gave me, you know, to cope with my illness. Because with all of the bullying and all of the stuff that I had going on outside of it, I needed to find a way to cope with it, you know, instead of walking around angry. So yeah, this is when I started really, really taking my training seriously. You know, shortly after that incident that I mentioned a few moments ago, about my heart catheterization, my doctors told me that you won't be able to go back training the way that you was. And I took that as a sign of motivation. Instead of me, quitting my training, that was when I really took the time and I took training serious. I was training on a regular basis. I mean, I could count on my hand how many days out of the week that I would actually be home. And that's what led to, a lot of the success that I had as a martial artist. I started kickboxing a lot more. I started getting more involved. My first official coach that really took me under his wing, his name was Tyrone Gooden. He was over Vision BJJ, Vision Martial Arts Academy. Still to this day, I absolutely love that man. He was that father figure that I needed. He helped, a lot of those holes.
We'll be right back.
Yes, sir.
We are back again with Mr. Clay and the Mayweather Boxing Gym. The event was sponsored by the house that God built, and we're going to find out a little bit more about that. But Mr. Clay was talking briefly about some of his successes, and I want you to continue telling us about how you were blessed with success, even though the failures or the challenges that you faced in bullying and all those different things, you still overcame. Go ahead.
Yeah. So piggybacking, yeah. Coach Tyrone set that pathway for me, man. He was my first kickboxing coach. I did my first kickboxing fight under him. I won. He took me. I won my first actual title belt, 7 fights in, with him coaching me through kickboxing and me training at some of the other gyms. Then we started competing in jiu-jitsu, started winning medals. I went off to the NAGA tournament doing jiu-jitsu, which is the North American Grappling Association, short for NAGA. Won some of those championships. Like I said, I've placed runner-up a couple times, but I was just getting acclimated with just competing and traveling. Like, that was just my life at the point. I would go to school, leave school, go straight to the gym. I would do my homework and everything at the gym, studying at the gym, just train, and I would go home. After that, half the time, my parents wouldn't even be there. Like, I would just walk home, or my coach would bring me home. And then fast forwarding, that went on for years. I went from Coach Tyrone to, Dimitri Paul, which is who my current head instructor is now, who I still train under. Like I said, the Lord just was giving me all these different father figures, not that my father was there, but it was just some of those holes that I really needed that intimate kind of help with, growing up. My coaches was always there, to support me and help me through a lot of those things. And they always reminded me, every single coach I've always trained under always reminded me to keep God first and acknowledge him in all my ways. And I've always done so. So, now, as an adult, I started really taking boxing seriously. I started going to Jab's gym, which is not too far from this current location. Mr. Coach there, name was Greg Coverson. Greg Coverson and Nikhil Miller were my 2 boxing coaches there. Still love those guys to this day. And, they took me, as far as I went in boxing. My first or second fight in boxing, I fought a guy who was just previously fighting in the Golden Glove National Tournament, so it's one of the largest tournaments, you can compete in as an amateur boxer, and I'm my second fight in, and I'm fighting this guy, still to this day, a lot of my peers and friends still say out of all of my fights, that might've been one of my highlighted fights. I remember that was the first fight that I literally I had it all together. My diabetes was perfect, as close as perfect I can get it. My A1C was good. I had nutrition sponsors. My health was good. I had all of the support that I needed. That was the most confident that I went. That was also the very first fight that my father actually came to watch me compete in. Wow. So, I felt like I had the entire support of the world on my back at that point. And, I put on the performance of my life at that fight as well. And, fast forward, and I did about 6 or 7 more fights after that. And I started realizing, how good, humbly, or being able to go out and fight was. But I was getting I asked a lot more about teaching. At the time, on and off, I would coach and train friends. I would go up to local high schools and local community centers, local gyms. I would work with kids and just pick up clients, and stuff like that. But then that was when I really started taking the teaching aspect serious. The highlight where that really took off, I want to say it was, what was that? 2020. Yep, 2020, back when COVID and everything started, that was a very traumatizing experience for me. But, with Innocent, my best friend that I grew up training with all them years, we was really, really close. I mean, I known this dude for like 10 years, and we clicked because I was a type 1 diabetic and he had neurological disorders. He got hit in the head with a brick when we were kids. So he was under a lot of different medications. At the time, the medications would drive him into a lot of suicidal thoughts. So when he would have those thoughts, he would always come to our house. It didn't matter if it was 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I didn't even have to be home. My parents would just welcome him in. My mom would often pray for him, whatever it was that he needed to try to seduce that. And this one particular incident, I couldn't get to the phone fast enough, and just fast forward, and I woke up, 3, 4 a.m. to find out that he had committed suicide. He shot himself in the head. Oh. And, I was in denial at the time because I'm like, man, for 10 years, this dude been on my phone. I'm like, I ain't never missed a call. Like, I've always been there. I don't blame myself for it now, but at the time, it was hard. I was like, man, the thought of the one time he really needed me and I couldn't be there, and he committed suicide. And then 2 days after that, one of the assistant coaches that I had when I was training back at Vision, he was another one of my father figure, more of a personal mentor figure to me. He ended up passing away from a heart attack 48 hours after my friend committed suicide. And then 3 days after that, I'm a big animal person. For those who know me, I love animals. I always have. I had a cat that I had since I was a kid. He passed away. Oh. So it was like all three of these people, some of the most influential people that meant a lot to me, I lost within a week. So I fell into a really, really deep depression. I wasn't taking care of myself, to the point I had went almost 6, 7 days with no food, no water. I barely could come out of my room. And then fast forwarding, I went into diabetic ketoacidosis. That was where I legitimately almost lost my life. My parents came home and found my head in the toilet. It was just blood and vomit everywhere. I couldn't control anything. I was incoherent. I woke up. I remember the ambulances and the paramedics arriving. They was trying to talk to me, saying like, "Hey, Mr. Clay, like, are you responsive?" And I could hear everything, but I couldn't respond. I couldn't move, and then everything kind of just faded out. And I woke up in the hospital. Come to find out that I was nearly deceased. I was clinically deceased they said for almost 36 hours. For a while, like I said, because I already had the issue with my EKG. So it was just like my heart frequency, my EKG completely flatlined for a moment in time. So, after recovering from that, to God be the glory, they told me that there was only about an 8 to 12% chance that I could have made a full recovery from that. Most people that go into ketoacidosis go right into that diabetic coma, and coming out of a coma is usually doesn't happen. So the Lord's hand was on me, and I was at that point that I realized, I had something much bigger to live for, because I had felt like I had just reached like a peak of my life where everything was going right. I had nice cars. I had all my friends. I was winning fights. I was traveling. My health was good. And then everything just took a toll, and I'll never forget, my doctor came in there, and the first thing, as soon as I had the strength to talk to him, I asked him, "So when can I get back in the gym?" And I'll never forget the look that he gave me. And he was just like, "Mr. Clay, unfortunately, you might not ever be able to get back in the gym." I'm like, "Why not?" He was like, "Well, it's a miracle that you're still here and that you're making a recovery now. But because of everything that went on with your body, I mean, all of my organs, everything had just about shut down. Like, They was telling me I would have to relearn how to eat. I'll have to relearn how to walk. Like, when I got discharged from the hospital, like, I still have footage of that. Like, I couldn't walk. They had to wheel me out on a wheelchair. They still had like all of these things like still connected to my body. I couldn't urinate on my own, couldn't have bowel movements on my own. I couldn't get up and walk on my own, and considering, this was like in the heart of COVID, this happened like July, August. So, it wasn't like people could come to the hospital to see me at the time either. So I was just there alone for those couple days.
Let me ask you this, because we got to wrap up very soon. What has your tragedy to triumph story helped in terms of youth or young people? How has it inspired youth?
It's helped in so many ways for me. But I would say primarily, just giving the youth something to fight for. Because when I see the amount of kids and the amount of people that get diagnosed with clinical illnesses on a daily basis, when I see the types of foods, that's being portrayed to our young kids, and how we're promoting all of this fast, all of these things that's causing all these rigorous health effects. And, then they develop these health effects, and then we don't have the support that we have nowadays. So everybody's looking for social media. They're looking for people. 10 years ago when I was battling a lot of this stuff, I couldn't go on YouTube or go on Instagram and just type up, oh, look at who's dealing with this. Now you can just go on there and look. So I started, priding myself on, you have to keep an image, and not a fake image, but it's just like being an inspiration, to see, my motivation was, if a kid was just to come to me and say, hey man, I didn't give up because of you. That's all I needed. And I got presented with that on several occasions, parents coming to me when I would work with their kids, cancer afflicted kids, other diabetics. And they just asked me so many times, because it's hard, anybody who knows about combat sports and being a fighter, to get medical clearance as a diabetic, there's almost no professional type 1 diabetic professional fighting athletes between boxing, kickboxing, MMA, if you name it. There's almost none, because it's nearly impossible to get medical clearance. And, for me to been able to do that, and being able to help other people do that, it's just set up a different pathway. It gave me a different sense of purpose. That's why I said I wanted to be this big top fighter of the world, and that's what I was training myself to become. But it was like when that whole incident happened with me, that last one in the hospital in 2020, it was like God showed me, I have a greater purpose for you. It was cool. I got a chance to experience what that life felt like. But it's like now it's about the outreach. Now it's about being able to be that inspiration for other people, because there's so many kids that's afflicted with my same illness, but they give up and quit because they don't see nobody that's doing it. And that used to be that was what I used to always say when people would try to encourage me. I'd be like, okay, show me somebody who's doing it though. It's cool to see like the end stories when you see people like, yeah, their success stories, but what was the process like going through it? Those moments when I wanted to give up, those moments when I wanted to quit.
You will have to hear the rest of the story next time.
Sir.